Thank you very much, Oliver. It's a real pleasure to be here. I'd like to thank all the organisers and especially to Chris Watkins for this invitation. I'm speaking today from the unceded lands of the Wongal people of the Eora Nation. And I'm going to speak about freedom and specifically about neoliberal conceptions of freedom. So the paper's called Neoliberalism and the Margin of Freedom. Today, the language of freedom is increasingly the preserve of the right. In the face of the COVID-19 pandemic, face masks are construed as threats to individual freedom, and across the world, freedom is associated with a right to flout public health and social distancing measures. In the United States, those demanding their freedom have held armed protests at state legislatures. Here in Australia, the protests have been less vocal, but here too, we've seen Freedom Day demonstrations like those held in Sydney's Hyde Park and Olympic Park in September. That same month, former Australian Prime Minister Tony Abbott used a London speech to condemn what he called health dictatorships and to advise giving families the freedom, in his words, to make elderly relatives as comfortable as possible while nature takes its course. The generation of the Second World War were prepared to risk life to preserve freedom, Abbott told his audience. This generation is ready to risk freedom to preserve life. More recently, the Australian government has introduced a package of major industrial relations reforms designed to aid economic recovery by supposedly giving employers more freedom to make mutual ad hoc agreements with part-time staff, allowing them to work outside their rostered hours without being paid overtime. And across Europe and the Anglosphere, the far right has weaponised the language of free speech as a licence to racist hate speech. These dynamics, along with those cited in the notice for this symposium, extremism, surveillance, big data, climate change, and global public health, complicate, in the words of the symposium's blurb, the modern conception of autonomy's emancipatory axis of oppression and liberation. What then are we to make of freedom today? In a recent book, Annalene Didin has contended that the current conception of freedom in the West as possession of individual rights that demarcate a sphere in which government can't interfere is not only novel and distinctive in the history of freedom, it in fact marks a decisive rupture with that history. For over 2,000 years, Didin argues, from the invention of freedom in ancient Greece to the 18th century revolutions in France and the United States, freedom was equated with popular self-government, not with the protection of individuals from government. Our contemporary understanding of freedom was not the product of the modern revolutions or of a grand Western tradition, she argues. It's the product of a long counter-revolution that may have been led by conservatives like Edmund Burke, but that deeply influenced the development of liberalism as well. This new elaboration of freedom against democracy was, she argues, to a large extent motivated by fears that the newly enfranchised masses would use state power for economic redistribution. In the war against democracy, freedom turned out to be a potent ideological weapon used against the very forms of rule once justified in its name. Didin's book offers a powerful challenge to attempts to conceptualise freedom as non-interference as the central legacy of a so-called Western civilization. As a genealogy of contemporary conceptions of freedom, however, the narrative suffers from its neglect of the emergence of neoliberalism and its influence on contemporary understandings of freedom. Although Didin singles out Friedrich Hayek as a particularly virulent opponent of popular sovereignty, she assimilates him to a long history of laissez-faire liberalism and overstates the extent to which the emergence of the strand of liberalism that he represented was a response to the Cold War. In this paper, I want to look in some detail at the evolution of the neoliberal conception of freedom. Throughout the 20th century, the neoliberal campaign against socialism, social democracy and economic planning was fought to a large extent on the terrain of freedom. This much is clear in the titles of two of the neoliberal movement's most prominent figures. Hayek, who wrote Law, Legislation and Liberty and the Constitution of Liberty, amongst others, and Milton Friedman, who wrote Capitalism and Freedom, and, with his wife Rose Director-Friedman, Free to Choose. The neoliberal advocacy of freedom was intimately tied to a myth of market competition as offering liberation from the paternalism and dependence of the welfare state. It was this myth that Ronald Reagan would draw on in 1986 when he used the term emancipation to refer to freeing poor families from welfare dependence. At stake in this emancipatory language was an attempt to mobilise the Republican valorisation of freedom and independence against a welfare system that was implicitly racialised and aligned with slavery, blackness and dependence. In my recent book, The Morals of the Market, Human Rights and the Rise of Neoliberalism, I showed that the neoliberal argument for freedom was always moral and not merely economic. For the neoliberals, the competitive market was not simply a more efficient technology for the distribution of goods and services. It was the guarantor of individual freedom and rights, and its demise signalled the rule of a coercive bureaucratic power. In this paper, I want to show that the correlate of seeing the competitive market as the sine qua non of individual freedom was always that this market order must be preserved at all costs. Neoliberal advocacy of freedom has therefore always been accompanied by an anxiety that freedom must be kept within strict margins if it's not to threaten the market order. Hence, neoliberal freedom, I want to suggest, ultimately becomes indistinguishable from what Hayek referred to as submission to the impersonal sovereignty of the market order. A liberalism that came into existence as an explicit critique of the naturalising myths of laissez-faire soon came to renaturalise the market order and insist upon the Thatcherite slogan, "There is no alternative." But what is or was neoliberalism? Despite excellent recent studies, a common view still treats neoliberalism as simply a doctrine of free markets, an economic fundamentalism, or a rigid commitment to laissez-faire. Such a view has profoundly distorted our understanding of neoliberalism and of its distinctive conception of freedom. In speaking of neoliberalism, I refer to a political and intellectual movement that emerged in the interwar period and that found its organisational form in 1947 when Hayek founded the Mont Pelerin Society. Although a majority of the Society's early members were economists, it also included liberal philosophers, journalists and historians, among others. The initial cast was comprised of members of the Austrian School of Economics, like Hayek himself and his mentor Ludwig von Mises, ordo-liberals of the German Freiburg School, such as Wilhelm Röpke and Alexander Rustul, Chicago School economists like Friedman and Frank Knight, and a host of others, including the Swiss diplomat William Rappard, the British economist Lionel Robbins, and the French philosophers Bertrand du Juvenel and Raymond Aron. One of the clearest and most succinct descriptions of the distinctiveness of neoliberalism comes from a 1951 paper by Friedman entitled Neoliberalism and Its Prospects. This was back when neoliberals referred to themselves as such. The basic error of 19th century liberalism, the young Chicago School economist argued, was to confine the role of the state to the maintenance of order and enforcement of contracts. Friedman framed neoliberalism as a reaction to this basic error. Neoliberalism, he wrote, would accept the 19th century liberal emphasis on the fundamental importance of the individual, but it would substitute for the 19th century goal of laissez-faire as a means to this end, the goal of the competitive order. This entailed much more scope for state intervention to create the conditions for competition than 19th century laissez-faire had countenanced. For all their undoubted diversity, the neoliberals of the early Mont Pelerin Society were largely united around the program outlined in Friedman's short paper. But early neoliberalism, we should recall, was also a defensive liberalism, a liberalism of those who saw themselves as besieged by an anti-liberal or collectivist onslaught that took many forms: National Socialism, Soviet communism, but also social democracy and the welfare state. Ever since the 1938 Walter Lippmann colloquium, dubbed the Birth of Neoliberalism, organised neoliberals had sought to challenge what they saw as the mass threat to independence and freedom. Here, I want to return to that colloquium, at which the term neoliberalism was coined, to examine the understanding of freedom that animated the development of neoliberalism as a distinctive political and intellectual movement. The colloquium brought together 26 liberals, 15 of whom would later participate in the founding of the Mont Pelerin Society, to discuss the American journalist Walter Lippmann's book, The Good Society. In that book, published the previous year, Lippmann argued that the most significant phenomenon of modernity was the division of labour, which had created a great society knitted together by relations of commercial independence. The intensified application of the division of labour, in Lippmann's view, had brought about great prosperity and given rise to a century of human emancipation. But unlike Adam Smith, for whom the division of labour was a result of man's natural propensity to truck, barter and exchange, Lippmann harshly criticised what he called Adam Smith fundamentalism. While Smith had provided a revolutionary account of the division of labour, Lippmann argued, he also created enormous confusion as his followers embraced the idea of laissez-faire and the belief that markets operated in a realm of natural freedom. For Lippmann, and for most neoliberal thinkers in his wake, no market was natural. All markets are products of legal arrangements, and so too is human freedom. Indeed, Lippmann described laissez-faire as among the cardinal fallacies of 19th century liberalism. At its origins, it was no doubt a revolutionary political idea that served to break down those laws, institutions and customs that were barriers to the extension of the division of labour, he argued. Yet laissez-faire was merely destructive and could not provide a principle of public policy. Moreover, its embrace had created the false idea that freedom could exist in the absence of law. I suppose that a solitary man cast ashore on an undiscovered island could be said to have freedom without law, Lippmann conceded, but in a community there is no such thing. All freedom, all rights, all property are sustained by some kind of law. In reality, he suggested, the law of the 19th century was capitalist law, which established property rights, contracts, and allowed people to sue for damages. Capitalism, Lippmann wrote, developed in a context of historic law and not in the free realm of nowhere. Yet the continuing liberal failure to appreciate the role of the state and law in consolidating this liberal capitalist order, and the inclination to conceptualise the laws of property as natural laws, he contended had halted the progress of liberalism. Convinced that exchange relations took place in a realm of natural freedom, free of state intervention, liberals had become simple apologists for the existing legal order and for the abuses and miseries it produced. Having assumed that there was no law there, but that it was a natural God-given order, he wrote, they could teach only joyous acceptance or stoic resignation. Liberalism was thus utterly incapable of providing a positive response to those who lived in misery or who suffered on account of the market. Such people had therefore turned away from freedom and from the division of labour, demanding collectivism and planning instead. Now, it's no small irony that a neoliberal movement that emerged as a critique of the stoic resignation of previous liberals in the face of poverty, mass unemployment and economic misery would ultimately come to counsel submission in the face of the very same phenomena. But before turning to that transformation, I want to linger upon the Walter Lippmann colloquium, where the concerns that animated Lippmann's book were repeatedly raised by participants. In his introductory lecture at the colloquium, the French philosopher Louis Rougier warned that the masses are willing to abandon their freedom in the hands of the one, chief or messiah, who promises them security. The great fear of many of the colloquium's attendees was that the masses and liberalism had permanently parted company. The security people seek today, the neoliberals believed, could only be secured by substituting state planning for the freedom of economic transactions. But the loss of this market freedom, Rougier argued, implied the loss of all other freedoms. In his words, freedom to consume what you like, freedom of choice of employment and of residence, freedom of assembly and of association, freedom of thought and of expression. All these would be destroyed by the imposition of a uniform scale of values that would conflict with the diversity of individual preferences. Planning was not merely a threat to economic freedom. From this perspective, it was fundamentally a threat to political freedom and civil liberty, and to the very continuation of a liberal order. This insight that only a competitive market order could secure individual freedom was central to the impetus behind the consolidation of neoliberalism in this period. At the beginning of January 1938, months before the Walter Lippmann colloquium, Hayek published an article titled "Freedom and the Economic System." There, he began with the insight that the key point of convergence between classical liberalism and socialism was that both believed that individual freedom required relief from the most pressing economic cares. And yet, among his contemporaries, he contended, the commitment to providing such relief had utterly usurped older concerns about economic freedom and individual liberty. Today, he wrote, the old cry of the opponents that socialism means slavery has been completely silenced. As early defenders of planning and the welfare state called for a new freedom, later dubbed freedom from want, Hayek argued that the attempt to achieve this new freedom was the greatest threat to what he depicted as the older freedom of individual freedom and civil liberty. Today, more than 80 years later, the contention that socialism means slavery has returned to exercise a surprisingly prominent role in contemporary political debates, notably in the United States. Given the significant influence of Hayek and his fellow neoliberals in resignifying socialism and social democracy as threats to freedom, it's worth returning to Hayek's essay, written at a time when liberals like him still saw themselves as a besieged minority. Are we certain, Hayek asked his readers, that we know exactly where the danger to liberty lies? In fact, he argued we don't know. And as a consequence, many of those who believed themselves to be fighting for freedom were, in his words, in effect, its worst enemies. Hayek's arguments have been honed in the context of the socialist calculation debate of the 20s and 30s, when defenders of economic planning, like the Austrian economist and philosopher Otto Neurath, had argued that planning would increase freedom by allowing people to plan for options that are not possible in a competitive market economy, such as prioritising better working conditions or more leisure time over higher productivity and consumption. For Hayek, the real threat to freedom came from those who demanded economic planning as a means to greater economic security. Planning requires a complete scale of values and an authority capable of ranking them, he argued. It must therefore be imposed upon all those whose values do not align with those the government has decided to plan for. The conflicts of values at stake are so irreconcilable, he stressed, that decisions about planning can't be made democratically. Rather, planning required an authority capable of imposing its will on all who dissent. The situation is the opposite of what is enabled by a liberal democracy characterised by capitalist markets, Hayek argued, which allowed individuals to be guided by their own values and therefore made such general agreement unnecessary. It's only capitalism, by which Hayek meant a competitive society based on the free disposal over private property, which makes freedom and democracy possible, he argued. And, he wrote, if a democratic people comes under the sway of an anti-capitalistic creed, this means that democracy will inevitably destroy itself. Central to Hayek's reconsideration of freedom was the insight that political and economic freedom are indissociable. While neoliberalism is often conceptualised as a strictly economic ideology, Hayek's arguments in favour of economic liberty were largely political. The economy, he insisted, was not a separate sphere that could be managed by a planning board without impinging on our political freedom and civil liberty. The tragic fact, he wrote, is that dictatorial direction cannot remain confined to economic matters, but is bound to expand and to become totalitarian in the strict sense of the word. Hayek didn't spell out here how he understood the strict sense of the word totalitarian, which he placed in quotation marks. But here, I want to argue that he and his fellow neoliberals, in fact, played an important and largely overlooked role in the development of the concept of totalitarianism and in its use to challenge not only Nazism and communism, but any form of state intervention into the economy. It was in the context of the Cold War that we witnessed the consolidation of a fighting liberalism that was pitted in opposition to totalitarianism. This Cold War liberalism conscripted an earlier Whig tradition of limited constitutional government, as Duncan Bell notes, in order to portray liberalism as synonymous with Western civilization. While Bell is attentive to the permutations and transformations of liberalism in this context, he tends to take its adversary, totalitarianism, for granted. Yet, even more than liberalism, the unification of Nazism and communism in the concept of totalitarianism was a fighting construct. The designation served to delegitimize Moscow's anti-fascism, to discredit Popular Front alliances between Social Democrats and Communists, and to undercut the argument that fascism and communism were antithetical. More than this, it served to refute any utopian political imaginary and to discredit attempts to transform entrenched economic inequalities. For Soviet dissidents and their supporters, attempts to transform society in line with grand utopian visions had foundered on the reefs of the totalitarian state. Such sentiment was bound up with a counter-revolutionary vision, according to which revolutionary politics was at best hubristic folly and at worst a totalitarian attempt at world domination. Although anti-totalitarianism had its moment in the 1970s, its roots were in the mid-30s. In an important essay on the origins of totalitarianism theory, James Chappell argues that while anti-totalitarianism is often depicted as a muscular secular humanism, it was in fact a product of Catholic antipathy to the Enlightenment. Chappell notes that the vision of civil society at the heart of totalitarianism theory is deeply Catholic, focused on the decentering of sovereign power to intermediate institutions, notably the church and the family, and matched by a distrust of the masses and the nation-state's usurpation of the traditional sources of authority. It was among conservative Catholics in Germany, France, and Austria, Chappell argues, that Bolshevism was included under the totalitarian label. Chappell suggests that it is not surprising that neither liberals nor socialists arrived at a fully fledged totalitarianism theory in the 30s. After all, the theory was always polemical, and neither liberals nor socialists, Chappell argues, had a stake in conflating Nazism and Bolshevism. Although this may have been true for the mainstream of liberalism in the period, it was emphatically not true of the nascent neoliberal movement, which sought to defend liberalism by casting it as the sole alternative to totalitarianism. The neoliberal thinkers played a critical and under-examined role in the development of totalitarianism theory and in promoting the view, to quote Hayek, that the opposite of liberalism is totalitarianism. The use of the term totalitarianism to refer to both fascism and communism was already widespread at the Walter Lippmann Colloquium in 1938. The previous year, Lippmann's The Good Society had addressed both fascism and communism under the heading The Totalitarian Regimes. In his opening address, Lippmann argued that the intellectual work to be accomplished was indicated by what is known about the totalitarian states, a category in which he included communism, National Socialism, and fascism. All three, he told his receptive audience, threaten the principle of law, the responsibility of the state to a higher power, the existence of the family, the independence of the church, and the right of the individual to voluntary association. All three totally attack all the traditions of Western civilization, he said, and do not push aside a few principles, but all of the essential principles and the determining institutions of our culture. Not only did early neoliberals follow Lippmann in mobilising the concept of totalitarianism to unify communism and fascism, they went further, assimilating Keynesianism and social democracy and economic planning into the concept as well. In his opening speech at the colloquium, Rougier told his audience, economic planning implies the totalitarian state. Earlier that year, in the essay on freedom and the economic system, Hayek had criticised those who believed that planning could be combined with democracy, along the same lines, criticising what he called the fatal delusion of believing that economic life could be planned while political life remained democratic and free. It was this belief that marked the neoliberals out from other liberals of their time. 2 decades after the Walter Lippmann colloquium, and 3 decades after the founding of the Mont Pelerin Society, the German auto-liberal Wilhelm Röpke reflected on a conversation he had held with the Italian liberal philosopher Benedetto Croce some years before Croce's death in 1952. Röpke had put forward the neoliberal position that liberty was indivisible and only a competitive market order could secure the conditions for individual freedom. Consequently, he had argued, the economy was the front line of the defence of liberty and of all of its consequences for the moral and humane pattern of our civilization. The role of economists, Röpke had suggested, was to fight on the most vulnerable part of that front against social planners, collectivists, and all those who wished to destroy the market order. Croce's astonishing reply, Röpke recalled, was that there was no necessary relation between a free competitive market and political and spiritual freedom. The economy, the Italian philosopher argued, was the realm of means, not ends, and there was no reason that a planned economy could not be a means to political and spiritual freedom. Little united the neoliberals at Mont Pelerin as clearly as the rejection of Croce's position. All those who gathered in the Swiss Alps in 1947 saw themselves as fighting on Röpke's front line to defend the market order against the forces of communism, socialism, and social democracy. As the Latvian political theorist Judith Shklar noted in an extremely prescient 1957 critique of this strand of liberalism, these conservative liberals, as she called them, saw totalitarianism as the latest and most calamitous expression of Western civilization's inevitable decline in the wake of the French Revolution. In a chapter of After Utopia, with the appropriate title The End of Radicalism, Shklar treats the conservative liberalism of her own time as an instance of a wider decline in social optimism and a fatalism about the potentials of political life that she took to be the defining feature of her time. Although much of the book is devoted to the dominance of romantic and Christian rejections of the Enlightenment, expressed in fatalistic alienation from the world and pessimism about its transformation, she also argued that liberalism had long ago lost confidence in the Enlightenment and faith in natural harmony and inevitable progress. Shklar traced this waning optimism as far back as Benjamin Constant, Alexis de Tocqueville, H.B. Acton, and John Stuart Mill, who were wedged between the optimism of the Enlightenment and the conservatism of its opponents. Although she doesn't mention it, it's worth noting that the original name proposed by Hayek for what came to be called the Mont Pelerin Society was the Acton-Tocqueville Society. Although they disparaged Mill as a socialist, the neoliberals otherwise positioned themselves very much within the lineage Shklar traced here. This conservative liberalism, she argued, had decisively taken sides against the Enlightenment and the legacy of the French Revolution, singling out the groups around the auto-liberal journal Ordo and the Mont Pelerin Society, notably Hayek, von Mises, Röpke, de Jouvenel, and Michael Polanyi. Shklar argued that far from offering a political alternative to Christian and romantic fatalism, liberalism had become increasingly conservative and fatalistic, providing a secular form of social despair. This liberalism was conservative, she argued, in treating the French Revolution as akin to a second fall of man, that had condemned humanity to catastrophe and ultimately to totalitarianism. Schlar was right to note that these thinkers largely took their distance from what the German autoliberal Röpke called the Janus-faced revolution. While the ideas of 1789 had created the air which we all now breathed, Röpke wrote in 1942, nonetheless, the revolution was a catastrophe. Röpke was not alone in seeing the French Revolution as the birth of totalitarianism. His autoliberal colleague, Alexandre Rousseau, argued that following Rousseau, Robespierre put into being the world's first totalitarian state. By 1792, Rousseau argued, the liberal revolution for freedom had been usurped by the totalitarian revolution of domination. Schlar was also right to note that the conservative liberalism of her time had lost faith in the Enlightenment. The history of the 19th and 20th centuries has discredited the hopes and prognostications of the philosophers of the Enlightenment, Ludwig von Mises wrote in 1957. The peoples did not proceed on the road towards freedom, constitutional government, civil rights, free trade, peace, and goodwill among nations. Instead, the trend is towards totalitarianism, towards socialism. In a deeply prescient reading, Schlar argued that the key features of this new neoliberalism is its profound determinism, its view of history as a rigid sequence of cause and effect that is immune to the analysis of the diversity of actual historical developments. It is marked by intellectual determinism, she suggested, for which, for instance, Rousseau's theory of the general will leads inevitably to totalitarianism, and the great sin of rationalism leads to social planning. It was marked also by economic determinism. Without economic freedom, Schlar noted, conservative liberals insist that no other kind of liberty, intellectual or civic, can possibly survive. Although she doesn't cite it, von Mises provides a paradigmatic instance of this pure fatality of neoliberal thought, when he remarks that the sequence towards totalitarianism may begin with a government that interferes in the market because, in his words, it wants to make it possible for poor parents to give more milk to their children. Proceeding step by step on this way, von Mises wrote, it finally reaches a point in which all economic freedom of individuals has disappeared. Then socialism on the German pattern of the Nazis emerges. As Schlar aptly noted, this was a disenchanted liberalism that had dispensed with the Enlightenment belief in natural harmony while retaining a hostility to the state. Their revulsion against rationalism, in her words, and their historical determinism, she argued brought them very close to Christian fatalism. Indeed, the neoliberals argued that the rationalist break with Christianity was at the basis of the crisis of Western civilization. The most dangerous state in the growth of civilization, Hayek wrote, may well be that in which man has come to regard all these beliefs as superstitions and refuses to accept or submit anything which he does not rationally understand. Distinguishing true liberalism, which is at ease with religion, from the rationalism of the French Revolution, Hayek deplored what he called the militant and essentially illiberal anti-religionism, which animated so much of 19th century continental liberalism. Unless the breach between true liberalism and religious convictions can be healed, he stressed in his opening address to the inaugural meeting of the Mont Pelerin Society, there is no hope for a revival of liberal forces. Citing Hayek on the necessity of submission, Schlar wrote, the tragedy is that reason itself can survive only if men submit to the forces of convention and tradition. Decades after she wrote this powerful diagnosis of the evaporation of confidence in the human capacity to transform our world, Schlar made the case for what she called a liberalism of fear. In the essay of that name, published the same year the Berlin Wall came down, Schlar argued for an entirely non-utopian liberalism, which draws its deepest grounding from a horror of cruelty. In 1957, Schlar seemed to regret the decline of utopianism and the demise of the Enlightenment belief that humans could improve ourselves and our societies. Then she criticised the cultural fatalism expressed in the reduction of politics to the demand for the expansion of individual liberty as an end to itself. 3 decades later, Shklar appeared to have made her peace with the decline of radical hope. In 1957, she had argued that utopianism is dead, and without it, no radical philosophy can exist. By 1989, she was advocating a liberalism of fear that was, in her words, entirely non-utopian. By that time, as I've argued in detail elsewhere, the neoliberal belief that political action was by definition violent, hubristic, coercive, and threatening to individual freedom had become widespread. The correlate of this view was that while we may attempt to protect individuals from the worst forms of cruelty, any attempt to decisively alter the social and economic order would result in catastrophe. It therefore reflected a capitulation to the view Shklar had previously diagnosed, which entailed turning away from belief in the human capacity to collectively remake our social worlds. In this attempt to restrain the human capacity for political action, it was this attempt, to restrain the human capacity for political action that was fundamental to early neoliberalism and its reconceptualization of freedom. Rejecting laissez-faire, neoliberals nonetheless argued that state action should be restricted to establishing a framework to support competitive market relations and should never be used to interfere with the results of such competition. What Shklar once saw as the tragedy of conservative liberalism, that reason could survive only if we submit to the forces of tradition and convention, was the necessary counterpart of what Hayek called the dethronement of politics. Hayek sought to preserve the market order from any conscious, willful political intervention and to depoliticize civil society. His aim was to replace aspirations to political control of the economy with submission to the compulsion of the market. Hayek made the centrality of submission to his account of market civilization quite explicit. A refusal to submit to anything we cannot understand, he wrote in The Road to Serfdom, must lead to the destruction of our civilization. For all the defences of freedom then, the neoliberals ultimately believed that freedom must be exercised only within strict boundaries to prevent it from interfering with the competitive market. It was perhaps von Mises, again, always the most blunt of the neoliberals, who made this clearest in his defence of what he termed the sovereignty of the market. Unlike political sovereignty, Mises and his fellow neoliberals saw market sovereignty as compatible with individual freedom. Yet they also argued that the functioning of the market relies on individuals adjusting themselves to its imperatives. For the neoliberals, adjustment to the demands of the market was secured primarily by price fluctuations, that is, by what Marx called the dull compulsion of economic relations. Writing about wages in an unregulated market, Mises contended that such fluctuations, in his words, penalise disobedience and recompense obedience to the demands of the labour market. As this penal language makes clear enough, the neoliberal individual is not free in any expansive sense. The demands of the sovereign market, Mises wrote explicitly, submit the individual to a harsh social pressure and indirectly limit the individual's freedom to choose his occupation. Yet he suggested that this pressure leaves the individual a margin, in his words, in the limits of which he can choose between what suits him better and what less. It is only within this predetermined margin that the neoliberal individual is free to choose. She may leave her home to pursue work in another city, or she may stay at home and drive for Uber. She may not join a trade union, let alone struggle against the capitalist exploitation of waged labour. For Mises, and I quote, "This amount of freedom is the maximum of freedom that an individual can enjoy in the framework of the social division of labour." Such a restricted conception of freedom, Hayek argued much later, in 1986, was accepted by everyone in what is now the industrialised part of the Western world until around 150 years ago. Everybody, Hayek argued, was accustomed to the rules and necessity of what are called commercial or mercantile morals. And so, in his words, everybody accepted the unavoidable necessity of having to adapt himself to changes in demand, supply, and prices in the marketplace. Everybody was, in Karl Marx's terms, doubly free. Free of the compulsion that typified earlier forms of exploitation, although of course we know that such compulsion still existed, but free also of any option but to submit to the harsh social pressure of the market. For Hayek, it was the decline of this pressure, as in his words, people grew up without having been taught the morals of the market, that gave rise to a new philosophy which taught people, in his words, that they ought not to submit to any principle of morals which could not be rationally justified. While for some, it was this newfound freedom from submission in which emancipation lay. But for Hayek, it was the rationalist who threatened both civilization and freedom itself. By pathologizing mass politics as a threat to individual freedom, neoliberal defences of liberty aim to confine human action within the margin of freedom offered by a liberal capitalist order. Today, in the context of a global pandemic, those margins have been slightly widened as states embrace emergency economic measures and massive deficits that appeared unimaginable only a year ago. As right-wing pundits and policymakers demand a return to normal, complete with the slashing of welfare payments and a focus on austerity and balanced budgets, it's time to break with the idea that freedom is synonymous with submission to the impersonal demands of the sovereign market. Thank you.